Welcome to Ill-Informed Opinions. We have our regular guest, Elizabeth Kidder Hinds, Kidder
I
Hinds.
respond to most anything people shout at me.
Yes. Uh, Mrs. Hinds, Miss Kidder is a uh, artist, a excellent writer, and a teacher for art for K through 8, I believe.
Yeah, I'm the triple threat.
Yes. And she tries sculpture sometimes as
Oh
well.
yeah, that was my thing in high school. I spent my entire high school career aiming for sculpture, only to realize I can't make a career out of that, and so I pivoted hard into drawing.
So she's been a teacher for a little bit, not as long as I was. She hasn't realized that the cost of teaching is way more than the amount of money you get from teaching, and
Oh
therefore you can't
goodness,
actually do it long term. So,
heaven! I wasn't doing this for the money. Was I supposed to be working for the money? Oh, I've been doing this backwards this whole time.
well, that's how I was. But then so then you have like mortgages and things. Um, so we're going to talk today about the recent spate of expert systems, and I want to use that term, expert systems, as opposed to artificial intelligence in art,
Mm.
and the uptick in their use. And I think that both of us have very strong opinions on this, and a lot of people do for good reason, and that um, the reason I want to distinguish between expert systems and artificial intelligence is that a true artificial intelligence is functionally a person, either through the Turing test or any number of other tests. And that is an issue which we will have to discuss and probably will. But currently, what we're talking about with things like ChatGPT um, and what's the other ones that they're using?
Midsommar, DeviantArt. There's a couple.
Yeah. So all those are expert systems, and that there's nothing creative coming from the computer itself. It's deriving creativity from humans, and that's where the sticking point is.
Yes.
So why don't you kick us off?
All right. Well, for me as an artist, when I first heard about AI art, I know a lot of people were trying to frame the argument. I'm sorry, not AI, but our systems use, our sophisticated systems use. I know a lot of people are trying to frame the argument as, oh, you can't get mad that technology is advancing. Technology is always going to advance. It's good, and you shouldn't be scared, and this and that. And I'm not scared of these sophisticated systems. I'm not scared of technology increasing and helping the world as it stands. But what I'm not a fan of is when it comes at the cost of humans. And for me, the artwork in question is even not even about the quality at this point. It learned from other artists' work, artists who were not asked, is it okay that we do that? We're not given compensation in any regard. And then who had to find out later that, oh, you're using everything I've worked for in my entire life to make knockoffs. Well, that doesn't sit right by me. Um, Personally, I can't imagine what it would be like to work so hard on something only to find a machine took it, didn't give me credit for it, is now saying, oh, I did this. It would be the same to me as if a person were doing it. So it's very little to do with whether a robot is doing it, and more so, did you ask permission before you did it? If not, we might have some issues there.
Yeah, I think I agree on that particular issue, because what you're doing is the thing is creating derivative artwork without sufficient buy-in from the originating artwork, from the
Mm-hmm.
artist. And the art has not entered public domain, and the art is still owned either by the artist or by someone who purchased it properly from that artist, either through a sale or through a contract such as work for hire or so on. So since the artist, once the artist makes a sale to someone, they really don't have any recourse if that person turns around and sells it. But that's
Certainly,
not
and that was a yeah. If they had wanted to do that, there are many artists I know who would, oh, you'll pay me money for this. I do that all the time for work I never get to see again.
yes,
Yes, why not?
that's fine. And that's not what we're talking about, though, because no one, like, for example, there's a lawsuit going forward with Getty Images. I highly recommend watching the Legal Eagle video on AI art, which I will try to link below. If not, just do Legal Eagle AI art and it'll should come up. But he mentions a lawsuit between Getty Images, which is where a bunch of work for hire is then sold to a company, Getty, and then they distribute it. So
Yeah, and the photographers aren't suing Getty for using the artwork that they sold to them. That is part of the deal.
yes, they
It's
transfer full rights. So
yeah. I think for me, I was so glad you sent me that video from Legal Eagle to check out, because at the end of it, he made so many good points about the legality and the ethics. And at the end, he said they're even talking about an AI lawyer, a chatbot that can fight cases for you. He said, which is stupid, and here's why in my exclusive video. And I thought to myself, why is it that your idea is stupid? That a bot replacing you is a stupid, outlandish thing that could never possibly work. And yet here, when it's about a field that's not yours, you think, oh, no, it's fine. It's fine if robots replace us.
well, I don't think he said that it was fine. I think he said it was problematic.
Well,
But
that's what I would say that this is too. Problematic in ways I don't think he quite understands. I would say it's not even about the copyright issue, which is something that's going to be debated with the Kelly McKernan case and the Getty case. I followed Kelly for like the past decade. So when I heard out she was on the case of suing them, that was really interesting to me to see that her work was so valuable to this program. But it was more so that, is AI art diminishing the value of the artist's work, or even replacing the artist within the market value?
yeah. Well, could you go into more about that Kelly case, because I'm not familiar, and I'm sure that a lot of the people,
Yes.
well, both of the people watching aren't either.
Yeah, there are three artists that have banded together to sue the companies like Midsommar and DeviantArt, who are making the AI art programs. Kelly McKernan has been an artist based out of Nashville for over 20, if not 30 years. Her style is very obvious to anyone who sees it, and I've been following her for a decade. I love her stuff. One of the other artists is Sarah Anderson, who you might recognize from Sarah Scribbles online, or her books Adulthood is a Myth. She's a comic creator. And then the third is an artist who I had not heard of before, but who's a concept artist for Marvel. And personally, I think it's her that's going to get this lawsuit more attention and possibly a different outcome, because you can say that you can't copyright a style or a vibe or a feeling, but when you get close to touching Disney, you can copyright Disney, and they will say, oh, actually, it's not okay that you use one of our artists who we use for this thing. I kind of feel like it's going to be the bigger companies like that who have real incentive in keeping copyright as it is and not changing it to be even harsher, to jump in and be like, yeah, actually, AI can't be allowed to do this because of our copyright.
Well, I think that there's a lot to be said for that. There's currently a debate in the Dungeons and Dragons community over Wizards of the Coast and its attempt to revise, or rather Hasbro's attempt to revise, because the Wizards employees seem to be against it as well, attempt to revise their gaming license. And one thing they wanted was to actually exercise the rights they legitimately had on the people using their content to create derivative work, such as worlds. And you and I are partnering in such an endeavor right now. And to be fair to them, they legally have that right. And many companies, especially Disney and also Paramount with regards to Star Trek and things like this, sees derivative work all the time. You made the work. You don't own it. Disney does. Paramount does, etc. And that's a legitimate argument. However, Wizards of the Coast had, and as of the most recent revisions, I have reinstated a variation where they are voluntarily giving up license to do that. And I think that if you're talking about artists in general who have voluntarily given up license, then I think that that is allowable for the AI to do that. But the problem is they haven't approached the artists. I mean, there's a bunch of amateur artists who will do things for recognition, which is a horrible thing, and don't do that ever. But being a teacher and having been in art school, right? This Savannah College of Art and Design, which is a predatory school, but somehow turned out both Elizabeth and my wife, who are excellent artists. So
maybe in spite of instead of because of.
I would agree with that. But there's a lot of people who would do it for exposure, but they haven't reached out to anybody to do that. And I think that's a major issue. They haven't made any attempt, it strikes me. No, not even an ill faith attempt. Definitely not a good attempt.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and
I think there's something to be said, to your point about how an artist might do something crazy to get attention. I kind of feel like the main crux of the problem here is that art has been for a very long time, but is continuing to be perceived as a commodity, something with a fungible or dollar amount that can be bought and sold, owned or possessed. And in general, I find that art is often fueled by money, but it should be that art is made and then it produces money, as opposed to I make this thing in order to make money. Good art will be good, and it will succeed on the merits of goodness. And that's perhaps a rather naive attempt on it. And I personally consider success to not be a monetary success. So I personally, having a child come up to me and say, I read your book and I loved it. What did you think of this character? That to me is more serotonin than $1,000 in the bank account. So for me, the success of my art has proven successful to me. It strikes me that something as life, not even it's important to life, it's essential to life. It's what makes life worth living, is having good art. It's why life is worth living in the first place. So to boil it down to, if I plug in these three things from these three artists into this one image and then sell it for profit, what statement are we making about art in general? Are we saying that, yes, art is literally just a series of ones and zeros. If you steal these three things and put them together, you'll create something that will effectively print money for you. There was even a shop in town my friend told me about that was producing and putting the prompts, printing and selling AI art prints of the Smoky Mountains, but in this style, in that style. And they did that for like an entire month. My friend found out, my friend told me about it. I'm like, oh, I mean, that's And then I talked to him more about AI art. He's like, oh, that sounds awful. And then within a month, they're like, we're done doing this. We're closing up the shop. It's not making any money. Let's go. I think that's the big thing. It appears derivative. It is derivative. It's not good enough yet, and probably will never be good enough to replace the existing stuff. But enough people could be fooled, and enough artists could lose jobs before that recognition is made.
Well, there's a couple things. First off, I'd like to mention that Elizabeth's in our mutual hometown of Knoxville, and I'm in Wilmington. So when she says around town, she means Knoxville, Tennessee, which is near the Smoky Mountains, which is a major tourist attraction. One of the most visited national parks.
I think it is the most visited national park, yes.
So images of the Smokies is a big deal there, and you can't walk 5 feet without seeing them on something, including license plates. So now there is something I want to say, though, in defense of expert system art, which is there are legitimate artists, I guess, because they're human, like Thomas Kincaid, and there's someone who I wrote a article on, way too glowing article on for a local paper named Robert Wyland, who paints big pictures of whales on the sides of buildings.
I remember him. Yes.
It's literal hotel art in that it's on hotels. And there's a term in the arts of hotel art, as in art that evokes nothing more than the image. And it's widely considered Thomas Kincaid, Robert Wyland levels of absolute crap. And my name was taken off the article, and the last 4 paragraphs were rewritten because it wasn't sycophantic enough to this terrible, terrible artist, but excellent draftsman. Why, his whales look like whales.
Yeah,
there's nothing behind the whales. There's no emotion or energy or anything behind his paintings. There's nothing really creative about it. But he's a great draftsman. And so with that sort of thing, I have no problem with an AI taking a photo or something which was created by an actual artist, okay, or something like this, and then recreating it either in the same style as the original photo or as in an artist whose work have entered into the public domain. Because there's no one who would be getting compensation for that if you just made it. Like, I see, students do this all the time. They make works in the style of so and so. In fact,
but
the Renaissance was full of artists who did that.
I'm doing a class project right now with my 7th graders where we are recreating famous works of art from various artists that they've researched. But notice how all of those situations are students. They're not then taking that artwork and saying, I'm going to sell it now.
But people do. I mean, there's a lot of modern art which is in the style of Rothko or God forbid, although my wife tells me he's amazing. She understands color theory way better than I do, and I'm going to go with that as the reason why it's good.
If she watched the same 3-hour documentary about Rothko that I did, that moved me to tears at the end. The man, all he does is paint squares. And as with most modern art, the story behind the art is infinitely more interesting than the final product, as I think that art is intended to be. The final product is irrelevant compared to how we got here, which is in its own form, an art.
A computer could, in reality, recreate spontaneously Kandinsky, which was the point of Kandinsky's work. The same thing can be said for any of the fugues, which have been written because fugues are functionally variations on mathematical equations. I don't have a problem with that because it could be derived naturally from an expert systems programming. Just like
how if you feed the rules of a haiku into an expert system, it probably could produce a pretty good haiku because there's a strict set of rules that you have to follow to make it happen.
Right. It's not to denigrate the artists who actually write the haikus. I don't think it takes anything from that. But if you have a sufficiently strong set of rules, you get the infinite number of monkeys problem.
Yeah.
Except it doesn't have to be an infinite number of monkeys. It just has to be 100. You know?
Yeah, and eventually, you hit it a lot faster with that point, with that many parameters.
Now, in order to, so, so like I think there's a good example in this, with Hans van Meegeren, who I don't know if you're familiar with, but for those who aren't, he was a forger of Vermeer's and other Dutch masters during World War II, actually a bit before, but. So he produced. René
Magritte was also accused of similar things, never proven, but that he was counterfeiting not only paintings but dollar bills.
Yes, there's a whole bunch of artists who made this. For example, Picasso was counterfeiting good sculpture when he tried to turn his hand at sculpture. It was a horrible counterfeit, but unlike his paintings, which are excellent for the most part, the ones that aren't scribbled on napkins to pay bills or
I love that story.
but but Van Meegeren was an excellent artist in his own right, but he couldn't create anything with much passion in it unless he was pretending to do it in the vein of another artist who at this point was out of copyright. So what he ended up doing was selling this stuff to the Nazis as if they were recovered works from Jewish, Slavic, homosexual, Catholic, etc. families who had been executed by the Nazis or had been driven out. So he was on trial in the Dutch court as a collaborator, and he proved to them in court that he could create a new Vermeer, which had never been seen before, especially not by Vermeer, in court, and they just shifted it to forgery, and he got 2 years in prison, but for forgery. But he definitely avoided anything more serious because he wasn't really a collaborator. He was selling them something that was not. He was basically functioning the way an excellent, amazing expert system would. In this case, it'd be like, make me a Vermeer with a puppy in it, and Van Meegeren would find a Vermeer with a puppy in it, And
I guess for me, the interesting thing about art, and the thing that I find falls more and more by the wayside, is that people don't actually know what they want. And I don't say that to sound condescending. I truly don't know what I want until someone gives me something that I didn't know I needed. And that's good art. I experience it all the time in video games. When I am given, not just a sequel to the same series again and again and again, but here's a game where you literally play the god of death ferrying all these creatures to the afterlife, which is not a game that one would describe as cozy or heartwarming, and yet was. It is one of the more profound gaming experiences I've had, but I would have never asked for such a thing, nor would I know it was something that I needed.
Which one was it?
This is Spiritfarer. It's excellently animated. It's wonderfully paced. The story, the gameplay, it all works together beautifully. I cried a dozen times. And it's a game that I would have never, ever asked for. And that's why I think art is so good. So if someone, I feel like Kickstarter is just flooded with things like, it's this, but new. I'm like, I don't want this, but new. I want something completely different. I don't want the same thing again and again and again. Give me something art. Give me something that. So uncovering lost Vermeers is like, that's cool. But also, aren't we past Vermeer? Aren't we past Picasso? Don't we have even more that the world can offer us besides what a bunch of historically important white men did over the past couple of centuries?
I would argue, though, that there's part of the point of schools of art is to emulate to some extent or other and add your own perspective on, say, for example, with Cubism, Duchamp's Nude Descending a Staircase, which both of them, I think 1 and 2, are brilliant ways to visually introduce someone to that style, and also to the concept of 4-dimensional representation on a 2-dimensional platform. And but I mean, Cubism fundamentally is, as a school, is that sort of thing, reiterated, but reiterated with fresh eyes. I mean, as writers, you and I are basically telling the same stories.
Yeah, don't
not
I say
each other necessarily, but
there's only 14 stories in the world to tell. We've already
or 8
told
or whatever. There's a specific number depending on how you measure the story.
Yeah.
I just read an excellent book with a horrible title, Handy Mythology Answer Book, which actually breaks down various myths into different archetypes, like the Earth Diver myth, where someone creates the Earth by diving into the chaos or the ocean and pulling up Earth from beneath, or the War in Heaven, or the Great Flood, or all sorts of things, which are common amongst so many different myths.
Yeah.
like Anansi bringing stories is the same as Prometheus bringing fire and so on. And those are separated by 1,000 years plus a couple thousand miles,
There's something to be said about that, because I've recently been digging into Joseph Campbell and his awfulness, which is something I didn't know until I started looking into him. Beyond his personal stuff, though, I think what you just said about how isn't it amazing how across space and time we find similar stories. That is undoubtedly true, because the human experience is a universal one. But at the same time, the whole thing about Joseph Campbell was that everything can be broken down into this one single monomyth. And that's just not true. No. And that's the cool thing about art, is that he tried to fit so many things into this mold that absolutely do not fit at all. In fact, are completely different. And that's exciting. That's cool. It's good that not everything is the exact same thing. Even though we're all telling the same 14 stories, there are people that do things differently, whether it's told differently or presented in the format or in the characters. And again, it's about, can you show something new that hasn't been seen before? And I feel like expert systems, because they cannot spontaneously auto-generate their own ideas, must by necessity be based on someone else's work. They have to be. But in the same, and again, if they're not human, if they're not considered human as consciousness, then we can't make the argument, well, humans do the same thing too, because in a court of law, we wouldn't consider it the same way.
Well, ChatGPT has written several novels. Someone in a group I'm in on Facebook had ChatGPT write a military science fiction novel. And as I said in the group, it wasn't the worst military science fiction novel opening that I've read. Admittedly, that's a very low bar. But there are some brilliant military science fiction novels like Scalzi's work on in The Old Man's War, or the original Forever War by Joseph Haldeman, which take very human exterior experiences like aging in Old Man's War, or isolation in the Vietnam War as a returning veteran, what Haldeman felt. And I don't see, even though they're basically, all variations of stories that have been told since the Iliad, and probably before, I don't see the AI being able to, the expert system being able to bring in that level of subtext. And I think that's really where the problem lies. From a artistic standpoint, is an expert system can't create subtext. Now, a true AI would be able to create subtext that we may not actually understand, because we don't have that perspective, and we will not be able to have that perspective. But there probably will be subtext, because it would be able to incorporate its own experiences and incorporate its own morals and ethics. And I think that's the difference between a true AI or any person and an expert system, is this ability to create art, legitimate art, I'm
so glad you brought up subtext. That's exactly what I was trying to think of too. You've experienced something, and that is why the way you're telling it is unique. Subtext is absolutely everything. Even like I was knocking on Disney with their copyright laws earlier, but it's like Walt Disney's own personal experiences that led to the films that he created. Even though they are retellings, his framing of them was substantive and different. And that's why even now, favorite
whoever story, he stole the stories from and then slapped his name over. Yeah. Just like Steve Jobs with Apple.
Exactly. Someone in the process had subtext. Well, there was a guy at the top, unlikely, but someone did have the subtext debate. Maybe we should do it this way. And that's why so many of the stories I enjoy are, that story that everyone knows. What if you didn't? Because someone came upon it and said, well, what about this? Why are we not exploring this part of it that's just as important to me because of the life that I have lived? And again,
your own novel, most recent and last, because you haven't finished your current one, have you?
Oh no, I'm trying to go by. Oh, who's the fellow who's never going to finish his book series, the one that everyone loves, and
George R. R.
Patrick
Martin.
Rothfuss. I'm taking the Patrick Rothfuss approach. Make something that's beloved, and then never go back again because you're afraid of how the public will perceive it.
But you need to have more than one of them.
There we go. I'll make two, and then never again. There we go.
Okay. So your own series is derivative of Beauty and the Beast.
And you know what? I'm glad you bring that up because yes, my impetus for writing was I like this story, but it's not hitting me. There's something missing, and that was what inspired me to write my first novel. For my second novel, it is not based on an existent fairy tale myth or perhaps subtextually, subconsciously, but not as intentionally as with my 1st.
Mm-hmm.
And that's why it takes a little bit longer. You got to build up your own internal logic for why things go around. You have to finesse it a little bit more because there isn't just the make sure you hit the points sort of motif of writing. And it can be trickier that way.
So if ChatGPT or some other expert system took your novel as a data point, and let's say you write a dozen of them,
mm-hmm.
and then was told to write Sleeping Beauty, this is where the problem lies to get back to the original problem, which is that only works if you explicitly say you can do that, or I'm interested in the result. And, with my work, this is not an agreement to do this. I need something signed and I need compensation. But with my own work, I wouldn't be upset if someone did that if they did it in a not-for-profit way and clearly flagged what the source materials were. Because otherwise, it's automatic plagiarism.
Right. We were even talking about that there are some bots who are writing articles, and by writing articles, they are taking other people's articles and literally changing out 5 words in a sentence and saying it's mine now. And yeah, that's really unethical. That's really bullshit.
Yeah. And then you get into the whole collage thing. Well, what if you take a whole variety of art forms? Let's say you legally take a variety of art forms. Let's say you take some Dutch masters. Let's say you take some Italian Renaissance. Let's say you take some pre-Raphaelites. And all of them actually are fairly photorealistic in representation. And you mix them together and you produce something with an expert system. It's more of a collage than it is an actual original work. And there's a huge debate that's been going on for centuries about the value of collage versus original work. And at what point does collage become a individual piece of artwork as opposed to a derivative of just several other things?
I guess it depends on what the end result is. We do a collage project in school with my elementary students, but the premise is that they are picking a main color. They design their own outline that they are to fill in and then go hunting for the color through magazines and newspapers and printouts and stuff. So in the end, the collage materials have very little to do with their creative output about what they've chosen. They're just picking a different kind of paintbrush to paint with. With collage, where you use pieces in a more intentional setting, I think that can achieve really great work. Jasper Johns did an American flag, and it's made out of collaged pieces of writing that has specifically to do with America and his thoughts upon it, which make much more of an impact than if he had just picked anything that was white or red or blue out of his magazine.
Yes, we have a mutual friend who did the cover of a book we collaborated on, Fake News, who works primarily in collage. And hers are distinct because she picks from a variety of sources and then adds her own, not just her own arrangement and interpretation, but also actively modifies it with paint or oil or other media to make it something different. And I think that's the point where I don't see an expert system doing that.
Mm-hmm. I agree. I think an expert system by design cannot break the rules it's learned. And half of art is once you have learned all the rules, now you must break them.
I don't necessarily know must, but I would say that we see this a lot with amateur artists. I saw it when I was teaching creative writing. I'm sure you see it all the time, where people break the rules without having a sufficient grounding of what the rules actually are. And
Correct.
the art
you
is
must
almost
learn. Yeah. The rules have to be first. It makes no sense to break something you don't know. There's a quote by Degas that's like, painting is so easy until you know how to paint.
right.
And yeah, because when you don't know, you can do anything you want. World's your oyster, but you also have pretty shitty paintings unless you're a savant of some kind. So
Yeah.
I completely agree that in order to learn how to break well, in order to learn, you must know what it is first. In order to steal, you have to know what good art is to steal from. And give it to credit to the sophisticated systems. They know what good art is to steal. They picked purposely very good artists to steal from.
Yeah.
So they knew what they were doing.
We have another mutual friend who's a writer who I won't name names because I'm going to crap on something he's doing. But he's trying to illustrate, or at least present illustrations of his current writing by taking AI art and doing that. Now, if he's doing that, I think there are legitimate reasons to do that. If you're doing that to inspire yourself when you create other art, or it's not for public consumption.
Mm-hmm. And this was something that I mentioned when I did my Instagram stories rant on this. The one highlight I saw of AI art was in Black content creators using it to see people like themselves in historical contexts where traditionally they were pushed out of the frame of what art survives today. I had a lot of African-American cosplayers who would use AI art to generate images that they could then cosplay as or see themselves in 18th century historical paintings. And like, that's cool. In an inclusive way, that seemed really cool. And that's what you were thinking. Like, if AI art is being used intentionally to say, hey, maybe AI art can't do everything, and here's why humanity is so important. The whole, can a robot pilot a jet? No, we should probably let human beings still do that for the time being.
Not as much anymore.
Not as much anymore.
I mean, do you want a non-computer to pilot a flying car?
I personally want a human being at some point in the system present for a car.
But I mean the actual, like, making all the decisions like they do on the freeway.
Oh, fair enough. But I also wouldn't want an AI that's like, I'm reading it in open space. I know you, the human, can see the truck next to me, but I read it as an open space. Let's go.
Right. So I mean, I think there will be more and more locations where expert systems are useful. I think using them as inspiration or baselines is actually a pretty good idea, but using it to sell and make a profit on isn't so much. Now, this has affected me personally in several ways. I'm an editor as my day job, and there's a program called Grammarly, which people have been using for a while, and that's basically an AI editor. And it does a decent, okay job. For internal communication and so on, I think it does its job well. If you're not concerned about public image, it does its job pretty well. It's not 100% by any stretch, no editor is, but it gives you a good baseline. The problem is, and this is the problem I pointed out, is when you have forward-facing product, which goes to other people, something like Grammarly can't, as yet, replace an editor, because part of being an editor is, as you pointed out, knowing when to break the rules, and a lot of these rules are arbitrary. Some of them make sense, like not starting a sentence with a conjunction because it creates a logical gap. But others, like not splitting infinitives, are just like we're thrown in because someone wanted to make English like a Romance language, which it isn't. So,
Or the Oxford comma, my personal favorite.
which is the best. No,
I love the Oxford comma. People are saying it's not useful. It's so important.
that's only journalists, and they don't count. Well, I mean, literally, this style, AP style, was designed because of the amount of space you had when you were laying out the lead when printing, and saving any space at all makes sense in that situation. They also didn't have dynamic spacing the way that we do with computers, so again, it makes sense. However, that hasn't been the case since the 80s. So we can get rid of it now, just like double space. We get rid of double space because because the proper spacing is an M space, not two N spaces. And I'm not going to go any deeper on that because it's really annoying to people who aren't editors. But Grammarly does a decent job. ChatGPT will do a less decent, but still decent job of what it's supposed to do. And so if you are looking for writing prompts, ChatGPT can work well to give you the baseline, just like Grammarly can work well to give you a baseline. But you can't let it substitute for your own judgment, which many people use Grammarly for, and you can't let substitute for someone at the end of the day looking at it and making the decision of where a noun or verb or adverb has to go in order to have the most impact. This is your point with AI, with expert systems cars, is that, it's going to do a better job on average than the average person. However, the average person needs to know how to do it. And the average person at the end of the day needs to be able to sit there and flag that is in fact a truck.
Exactly. Yeah, at some point, a human being was involved in the process. So it's how good was a human being when they gave the robot that job to do.
Right. And of course,
and I just think it's
once we get your eye, that goes out the window.
Yeah. And I just think it's very telling, honestly, that they picked artists who absolutely are like in their field, known, respected, and well liked, but also artists in that they're not millionaires, they're not multi-billion-dollar corporations, they are just a person making deeply personal artwork to share with others. And that was what they used to train their system, as opposed to Disney, for example, which is a widely universal style that everyone could recognize immediately.
Anime.
Just saying.
Every friggin' 8th grader comes up with an anime.
Exactly. Yeah. Why were there no? Yeah. There are so many.
And anime the anime style was specifically intended to be easily reproducible. So you could swap out artists because the artist doesn't matter. Neither does the writer.
So. Right. I mean, there's so many different mores when you think about it, because you're right. There was a whole period of time where the people who were creating things were not the people credited because it seemed irrelevant to the process. But
pre-Renaissance art is all pre-Renaissance art to a great extent is basically this. I mean, the way they made statues in ancient Rome, which is one of the reasons why I love the Romans, because they just knew what they were doing.
They stole absolutely everything.
Yeah, they would mass produce a variety of heads, mass produce a variety of torsos, a variety of arms, variety of legs, and then you could go and you could select which arms, legs, and heads would fit on which torsos, and assemble the statue that you wanted from pre-produced work. And no one cared who the artist was. It would always be in the style of so-and-so, who was Greek and probably dead. But,
I get it. The artist was irrelevant because for a long time, art wasn't about the person who made it. It was about the person who was depicting. And because the last 400 years have been more of a shift towards the individual, now it matters a great deal who the person behind the painting is. And that's why artwork has gotten more personal and it tells a greater story. It may be technically different than the Renaissance, which is like peak. But I don't call it peak as in best. I call it peak as in it's a turning point. It's where art just pivoted so hard from being about only the famous and rich and the artist's irrelevancy to the artist's vision mattering so much. And it could be anyone who was in art, anyone that art could be made about.
Yeah. Well, we're going to have to end with that because we have a deadline here. Could you
This is
tell
on
people
dead.
where they can find you?
Certainly. My Facebook got hacked 3 years ago, so if you find it, make sure you tell the bot who's monitoring it hi for me. But if you actually want to follow up with me, I'm on Instagram at ekidderillustrator.
And
I also have a website, elizabethkidder.com. You can check that out for my work on whether that's drawing or writing. And if you're interested in purchasing, I would recommend my first novel, Colorblind, which is available for purchase on Barnes & Noble, Amazon, and all those other slightly disreputable companies that you're aware of.
okay. Well, thank you so much. I hope to see you again. And as always, send any criticism, complaints, commentary, rants, etc. In the comments below and in the links, which should be running across your screen if I ever get around to editing this. And and I hope to hear from all y'all later. I hope this was instructive. And I think we'd be happy to revisit this topic. Would you be?
Definitely, considering that it's ever unfolding. I'll be curious to see how legally it gets treated.
Okay. Well, take care, everybody. And this has been Ill-Informed Opinions with Elizabeth Kidder and Joseph Cadotte.